the Nixon Foundation's Distinguished Speakers Series. I want to begin by welcoming and thanking all the members of the President's Council and the Associates Club, two annual giving organizations that support the mission of the Richard Nixon Foundation. So thank you so much for your support. And it's thanks to your support that this Distinguished Speaker Series is truly one of the most active in Southern California. This evening, we have the pleasure of welcoming three distinguished authors and historians who have quite literally written the book on First Ladies. It's entitled, Remember the First Ladies, the Legacies of America's History-Making Women. This new book is available in the Nixon Library's gift shop, and its three authors will all be on hand to sign your copy this evening. Here to take us through the evolution of the role of the President's spouse are Diana Carlin, Professor Emerita of Communication at St. Louis University, and a retired Professor of Communication Studies at the University of Kansas. She has taught courses on First Ladies at 3 universities. Anita McBride, Director of the First Ladies Initiative at American University, School of Public Affairs. Her experience includes service in 3 presidential administrations at the White House and at the State Department, and she was Chief of Staff to First Lady Laura Bush. Nancy Kegan Smith retired in 2012 as Director of the Presidential Materials Division of the National Archives. She is co-editor of Modern First Ladies, and she lectures on First Ladies and presidential records. Together, they not only have written this new book, they are co-founders of the First Ladies Association for Research and Education, also known as FLAIR. So you have the best 3 First Ladies experts in the world that you're about to hear from. These co-authors will be joined in conversation this evening by Frank Gannon, a former special assistant to President Nixon, who later worked with the former president in San Clemente on the research and writing of RN, the Memoirs of Richard Nixon. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the co-authors of Remember the First Ladies, Diana Carlin, Anita McBride, and Nancy Kegan Smith.
Well, good evening. Welcome to the Nixon Library on a beautiful day. We've been out touring the grounds. I have to say, in terms of this is a presidential rather than a first lady, but we have a profile in courage on the stage tonight. To cut to the chase, Diana Carlin wrestled was it in the Denver airport with a suitcase and the suitcase won? But it was not easy for her to be here, and we're really grateful.
Thank you.
And when Jim said distinguished panel of authors, archivists, historians, writers, activists, staffers, it really this is a master class in history and. In history. And they have written a doorstop book called Remember the First Ladies, which goes from the beginning to the end. Well, not to the end, it goes, goes from the beginning to the present day, which is only the beginning. Just to sort of, well, all my questions will be dumb, so here's a dumb question. The bookshelves are groaning with presidential biographies, and there are hours and hours of documentaries. So how does this book, Remember the First Ladies, sort of add to or change our knowledge of them, and how does it increase or enhance the average reader's appreciation or understanding of them?
Okay, well, I'll start with that one. You should understand a little bit about how this book came to be. As I said in my introduction, I taught courses on First Ladies at 3 universities. I have written extensively. I'm a political communications scholar, so I studied political rhetoric. And I always included a section in my Women as Political Communicators course on First Ladies, and my students loved it so much. They said, please do a whole semester. So then I started doing an entire semester course. But there was no textbook. I had to cobble together little bits and pieces from here and there, and it just never was satisfying. So I had gotten an email about 3 years ago asking if there was a textbook I'd like to pitch to a company in San Diego. And I said, yes, First Ladies, because there are a lot more courses and units being taught. So we originally wrote a textbook, and it's the first ever textbook on First Ladies. And our editor loved it and said, you know, this doesn't read like a textbook, it's really interesting. And that's what the students have, and the students have all said that. And most of them said, you know, this is the only textbook I've ever really read thoroughly. And one of them said she would just curl up because it was like reading a novel, and she'd read it when she'd go to bed every night. So she said, would you be willing to adapt it to a general audience? So we did. And what I think this book does that no other up to this point does is we are looking at the entirety of the position of First Lady. And we're looking at how that position has evolved. And there are books that have, you know, have all the biographies, but they're written by different people. They're always edited volumes. And this also has thematic chapters. There was a book written early 2000s that was edited, so they're written once again by several people. But we had 3 of us doing this, so it's very coherent. Our themes are carried throughout. We relate one First Lady period to another, and no other book really does that, and looks at the context of the times in which these women were First Lady. And one of the things that the students asked us to do, because a lot of them are ahistorical, is tell us more about what their husbands were dealing with and how that affected them. And we give enough biography that you kind of sense who they were and how they became who they were, but it's not a book of biographies. And so no other book has really taken the approach we've taken, nor have they, like I said, gone from one First Lady to another with only 3 authors who were working together and made a coherent story about the First Lady position.
I'd like to add just one thing to that, and thank you, Diana. That's such a great description of how this started and where we are. The publisher was actually quite surprised and very skeptical that 3 people could work together on doing a book like this. They've had 2 authors for a book, but 3, they weren't sure how this is going to work. And it really was a terrific professional experience for each of us. I mean, both Diana and Nancy had written books before. I hadn't, and I've been at a university now for 10 years. I needed to publish a work like this. I've published a lot of op-eds, chapters for other people's books, but not a full comprehensive book myself. So Diana, having done it before, and Nancy too, had a process in place that we could follow with timelines. And very quickly, our publisher just left us alone because they knew we were on target and on time, and they liked what we were submitting.
And I'd just like to say it has been a pleasure working with my 2 friends. We bring different backgrounds, so those backgrounds are reflected in the book. But also, we were addressing a very male-centric history. History is still somewhat male-centric, and it was very interesting to all 3 of us that when we were teaching, the men in the class said, why didn't we know this? Why haven't we heard this before? And it's like, yes, Betty Ford did a conference in 1984, first conference ever on First Ladies, that sort of ignited with Dr. Lewis Gould, who was the father of First Lady Studies, the First Ladies field, and we feel like we've finally, in 2023, 2024, to have the first college textbook on First Ladies, and to have a book that looks at both their biography, how their lives affect the themes, the big themes in American history, which you really can't understand the presidency without understanding these incredible women.
Exactly.
Somehow, in just over 500 pages, you...
We left
a way of saying it's too
but who's
long.
counting?
Yeah, we left about 500 on the cutting room floor,
Yeah.
too. So.
Well, to underscore something that Diana said, it is almost unrelentingly readable. So and it's organized, which is what I want to ask you about. It's organized in a way that makes it easy to read and access. So you've got 500 pages, you've got a sprawling subject, 46 first ladyships and a larger, slightly larger number of women in those roles, spanning more than 2 centuries, but you have managed to make it manageable and accessible and readable. How did you go about organizing it? What's the organization of the book? And then, apropos what you were just saying, what was the division of labor between you 3? And
Okay. Well, we sat down and decided, that we wanted this to be an evolutionary view. And so we came up with some themes that we thought had sort of gone through the whole history of First Ladies. And we each looked at where our strengths were. So for example, with me studying rhetoric, political communication, the chapters on communication were my leads. Anita looked at the history of the White House, the history of the position, because she had been in the White House and had done some of that. Nancy, had written on several other First Ladies, so she took those. I took some of the early eras, so we just said, where are our strengths? And then we had a system where, whoever was writing, and there were some chapters where 2 of us would write it, and then we would trade, and then we all looked at everything, and we went through it multiple times, and the nice thing, like Nancy says, we have different backgrounds, so somebody would know something or say, we should dig around somewhere to find out about this, or we left out this historic fact, and so we'd add to it. So really, everybody contributed to every chapter, but in different levels. And we also kind of coordinated our writing styles. Yes. So it's not obvious that 3 people wrote it, like when you get an edited volume, and they're all individual chapters, and they're all organized differently and different approaches. It really is pretty seamless.
According to Wikipedia, so it must be true, beginning with Martha Washington and including Dr. Jill Biden, there have been 46 First Ladyships and 54 First Ladies, including 43 official and 11 acting. What were the origins of the role of First Lady? Did the founders give thought? Is there a missing Federalist paper dealing with it? Take us back to Martha Washington and Abigail Adams, Dolly Madison. How did their First Ladyships, is that the term for it, First Ladyships, set a precedent for the future?
Well, Frank, you can use that term.
Okay.
It's very interesting. Of course, the First Lady, which the American public expects so much of, has no constitutional or legal basis. And when George Washington became president, much to Martha's dislike, because Martha wanted him to retire, he and his staff immediately defined that she would sort of head up the ceremonial role. She would do the social hostess role, which Martha was extremely good at. She joined him later than George took the oath of office, but when she got there, she found out that her role was pretty much defined, and she could not return social calls. Well, Martha, being a Virginia First Lady, really did not like that, and that's when she wrote that she felt like a prisoner in the White House. She later broke that rule, but she did very much of the hostess role for George. She did the more formal entertainment with men, then he would join her at dinners and receptions. She was very gracious, and she set the role. Being American, she would wear American-made clothes. She tried to be dignified, but not too royal, so there was a careful balance. Abigail Adams, the one negative thing is she did bring slavery into the White House.
Martha did.
Yeah. Abigail Adams hated slavery, but she was very close to Martha. She followed basically Martha's social role, but Abigail was definitely John's close political advisor. They created a great documentation of the early history of the Republic and their letters back and forth, because Abigail was only with John as First Lady part of his time as president. And she was the first sort of media First Lady. She would write letters to friends and asked that they plant them with various editors. And oh my goodness, sometimes she wrote the editor she knew and said, could you please publish this? So she really took that role. The thing that we point out about Abigail, where she probably went too far, was factions were being created, and she was very much John's defender, and she very much pushed the Alien and Sedition Acts that John signed, which made it criminal to talk out, to be critical of the president, and was very hard on aliens. And Thomas Jefferson disliked that act so much, he got up and left and went back to Monticello. And many historians think Adams was not reelected because of the Alien Sedition Act. Dolly, incredible First Lady, very admired for her social entertainment. She broke the more formal model, and she went across the aisle in terms of entertaining and creating bipartisan functions. She would have his foes, Madison's foes, as well as his friends. She would invite so many people that her receptions became called squeezes, because she really had to squeeze through the room. And she had the ability to be incredibly charming, particularly to men, so that almost every man, whether it was Madison's foe or not, liked her. And they were an incredible couple because Madison was very introverted. He was short, he would wear black clothes, and here was Dolly, tall, wearing turbans, French clothes, designer things, very colorful and very outgoing. So Dolly really created that important role of bipartisanship, and in terms of using social functions to help the president pass his agenda, to help him with his politics. And so those three were incredibly important at setting the role.
And one thing that should be noted is that they were not called First Lady.
Right.
That term did not really come into usage until the 1880s. And Martha was Lady Washington. Abigail was Mrs. Adams, but they often called her Mrs. President Adams. And Dolly was referred to as, get this, Lady Presidentress. Imagine doing that in the 21st century. And then Martha is the only First Lady who did not live in the White House. It was not completed until the Adams term was almost over. So, but the First Lady title really didn't catch on until it was later. And you might want to mention
the first time. The first time that the term was actually used was in 1849 at Dolly Madison's funeral, when President President Zachary Taylor, eulogized her. And this was a state funeral in Washington. The entire city shut down. The federal government attended, the cabinet, members of the House and Senate. That's how beloved she was, and the mark that she left on Washington, and so many first ladies that came after her that she helped. But at the eulogy, President Taylor referred to her as the First Lady of the land. And so that was the first time we really heard the term First Lady, although, as Diana says, it really wasn't in our lexicon until much later in the 1880s or 1890s.
And before we leave Dolly, I keep forgetting the saving of the
portrait.
Gilberts.
Well, I was going to say, we're here in the replica of the East
right
Room.
over there, and Dolly would be very mad at me. She's coming back and telling me. She did say that she was very brave. The British were in Washington. They were coming to the White House, and she made sure the portrait and key documents were saved before she left, and she was all by herself. So I do want to be sure that I say that.
Is it true that she cut she had them cut out of the
This-
frames and then rolled
It
them
was
up
the
in order
staff,
to take them
right,
away.
and the
She had
slaves.
someone do it.
They cut
Yeah.
that out of the frame and rolled it up and took incredible presidential documents, you know, that were, basically her point, she knew enough, she was like the nation's first archivist, that the portrait of George Washington should not get in the hands of the British. Can you imagine that being brought back to London and being paraded through the streets of London, that the British king had taken down the American president and the new American nation?
Today, the First Lady is part of the national consciousness and frequently part of the national conversation, but it wasn't ever thus. You write in Remember the First Ladies, you write about two important developments: the creation of the Office of the First Lady and the First Lady's evolving role in communications with the American public. Can you describe something about those two developments?
Sure, I'll talk a little bit first about the creation of the office because as Nancy had mentioned about Martha Washington was a slaveholder, were our 10 first families, other than the Adams. Of course, Mrs. Adams just could not reconcile how a nation founded on freedom could hold people in human bondage. So they did not have slaves, but that was mostly the staff support that was around the first family in particular. So there was no staff. Well, fast forward really quickly to this, is the first professional staff member ever hired by a First Lady was Edith Roosevelt, President Teddy Roosevelt's wife. She came into the White House with 5 rambunctious children, a very busy household, expectations for a very busy social calendar, and so she hired a social secretary. So that was the first professional paid position. She really was successful in getting the federal government to pay for that out of the White House budget. And it wasn't really until much later, and we're getting to Jackie Kennedy's time, where the first assistant for press relations was actually hired, and it was a function under the social office. There was no real press office for the First Lady yet. But Jackie Kennedy's admonition to her staff person was, because she really did not like the intrusiveness of the press, and so she told her assistant for press relations, give the press as little as possible, but do it in a nice way. And the Lady Bird Johnson, who followed her, of course, really professionalized that role. She hired a professional person from the media, Liz Carpenter, to be the first press secretary. And that really sort of changed everything in terms of communications, which I'll let Diana get to in a moment. But the next really major breakthrough for the Office of the First Lady that really put a structure around First Ladies that continues to this day was in Rosalind Carter's time. The White House Personnel Authorization Act of 1978 for the first time actually established budgeted positions for the Office of First Lady. Everybody was considered staff of the president assigned to the First Lady. Again, the First Lady is not the elected official, so doesn't really have the authority to have appointed staff. It's the president's staff, but they're assigned to her. And that structure that Mrs. Carter put in place with a policy director and office director, she had continued the press function and other functions, is largely in place to this day.
And she got a place in the East Wing.
And that's right, she was the first Lady to put her office actually in the East Wing. Thank you for reminding me of that, Diana. Most First Ladies up to that time worked out of the dressing room in the White House, up in the private residence. And so they had staff in the East Wing, which was built in between 1942 to 1945 to really accommodate a growing presidential staff. But this was the first time a First Lady actually came out of the bedroom and out of the shadows and had her office. You know, interestingly enough, you know, Barbara Bush and others that followed Mrs. Carter went back to work up in their dressing room. Barbara Bush felt that her staff was already on top of each other. They didn't need to have, you know, her taking up space in the office. But again, that's an important point to remember.
And
Mrs.
we
Carter
should
worked
also remember that Rosalind, in her autobiography,
Yeah.
said
Oh, yes.
that the most serious fight she ever had with Jimmy was asking him for the money
staff.
for staff. And he was telling her how hard she worked, but when she asked him, he said, everybody in the executive office wants more staff.
Right, I
But
can't give
she
it to
kept
you.
at him, and so she did.
Well, he
get-
campaigned on cutting the White House staff, and
That's
she
right.
comes in, you know, wanting to increase the size of the First Lady staff, not even, you know, the elected officials. So you're right, that's a good reminder.
And one other thing I want to say is this is historic for us, because this is the first time that we have ever done a program in a reconstruction of the East
This is
Wing.
beautiful.
This room is beautiful, and the Nixon Library is the only one that has a reconstruction of the East Wing. So thank you for the
That.
wonderful
Setting for us.
accommodations.
Well, thank you for coming. You mentioned this internal disagreement between President and Mrs. Carter. There are examples in the book of disagreements, some public, some private, between the presidents and their First Lady. Are there any that are your favorites or that come to mind?
Disagreements. Well, there's one example of Jackie Kennedy. In fact, the issue that she wanted to take on was historic preservation and preservation of the White House. I mean, she had visited the White House as an 11-year-old girl, was very disappointed, walking room to room. There was nothing to describe what was on the walls, what the history of the house was, and she remembered that. And so as a 31-year-old First Lady, she comes, you know, to Washington, and this is the first thing that she wants to do, establish a guidebook, really make the White House the museum quality that she believed it deserved. She wanted Americans, and particularly young children, to understand and appreciate their history and appreciate the White House. But the president and his advisors, and particularly the president, did not want her to take on that issue. Is, in his mind, considered very elitist, and that it would not go over well. But she too persevered. And of course, we have her to thank for the establishment of the White House Historical Association, the private funding arm that helps to keep the White House the museum quality that it is, that funds the acquisitions, funds the portraits, all the restorations, because Mrs. Kennedy knew there would never, ever be enough government money to ever take care of the White House, and she was right. That's one example. I mean, Betty Ford in the ERA.
Betty,
and you may
Betty
wanna
Ford
talk
with,
about
yeah,
that.
with the ERA. She was an ardent ERA supporter, and she, you know, was quoted as saying that her husband's staff thought she was a little too outspoken,
Right.
and he was sort of lukewarm on it, and she had to install a private phone line in the family quarters that she paid for personally, because she was calling the states and the state legislators, urging them to, you know, they had to ratify. And they were short of states to ratify the amendment. So she's calling state legislatures around the country, and she had to do it on a private line that she paid for. And she gave a speech in 1975 when she was at the height of her work, and she really called everybody out. She had a line in there saying that, you know, it shouldn't matter what a woman's husband does, that she shouldn't be silenced. And that she, even though she was married to the president, she had a voice. She believed that women, whether they chose to work in the home or whether they chose to work outside the home, needed to be respected and make decisions, and that the ERA was essential to have that happen, and so she shouldn't be quiet. So that was a pretty public statement, I think.
And if we take it forward very recently, there's an example of Melania Trump making ads for how people should mask right after.
And social distance when her
Yes,
husband said
and
not to.
social distance right after President Trump said he didn't think it was necessary. So that was a very public disagreement.
Exactly.
The
Most
Nick-
people
the Nick-
don't know. No, that most people don't know, or she's really not given credit for doing that, standing on the front steps of the White House and in front of the North Portico and recording a public service announcement for the Centers for Disease Control at the same time that President Trump was saying you don't have to social distance and you don't have to mask. So that's a public, you know.
The Nixons, as you point out in the book, didn't really disagree. There were two major issues on which they, the appointment of a woman, first woman justice to the Supreme Court, and the Equal Rights Amendment. And he had supported both as had the Equal Rights as he had the Republican 68 platform, and it was really out of his hands. It was then it was in a legislative matter. And then he did try to appoint a woman justice, and wasn't able to, so she was disappointed with that, but I don't think they disagreed there. Pat Nixon figures prominently, of course, throughout Remember the First Ladies. Beginning on page 217, whoever wrote it, or maybe it's a joint, deserves great kudos. It's
Diana and I think
very,
did this
well, it's a
chapter.
very short biography, but it is comprehensive. It is, it's just a terrific summary of her life, hitting the high points, the low points, so it's very candid. But it's only like 10 or 12 pages, as are all. The sort of the biographies of the First Ladies are quite short, and then thematically they arise later. But, and the chapter is called Thelma, Catherine, Pat, Ryan Nixon, an Overlooked First Lady. Earlier this evening when we were talking, Nancy suggested, with the 50th anniversary of the president's resignation coming up in a couple of months, she suggested reading a passage from the Nixon memoirs, RN, in which he describes how Mrs. Nixon rose to that traumatic occasion of the resignation, and he paid her a poignant tribute. And this is what he wrote in RN, in his memoirs. I knew how much courage she had needed to carry her through the days and nights of preparations for this abrupt departure. Now she would not receive any of the praise she deserved. There would be no round of farewell parties by congressional wives, no testimonials, no tributes. She had been a dignified, compassionate First Lady. She had given so much to the nation and so much to the world. Now she would have to share my exile. She deserved so much more. How would you characterize Pat Nixon as First Lady, her role, her contribution?
Go ahead, you start.
Okay.
Extraordinary.
Well, that title we decided on because it's obvious. Tell you a little, my husband was a history major. He was a retired Kansas appellate court judge, and he loves research. So I had him researching some things as we were writing, and he was doing some things with Pat Nixon, and he kept saying, come read this. Did you know she did this? Did you know? And he now will tell people, she's my favorite First Lady. And they'll go, Pat? And then he goes off on the chain of everything she's done. But diplomacy, we talked about Dolly and parlor diplomacy. Pat took diplomacy worldwide. No First Lady since her has actually addressed a foreign Congress, a foreign parliament. And she addressed two, representing the president in Africa. I mean, she went as his official representative. And when they went to China, because the media did not follow the meetings that the president was having, we were seeing China through Pat's eyes. And she was so sensitive to culture and so sensitive to what we needed to see back home and what would make the Chinese happy, that she would always plan her itineraries anytime, she traveled with him, so that we were really seeing a country and a culture. And one of my favorite pictures in the whole book is the picture of her when she went to Africa and addressed those parliaments in the traditional garb of West Africa. It's a stunning photograph, and she is beaming, but she also, like I said, understood what I call stagecraft that goes with statecraft. Ronald Reagan was a master of that, and Pat Nixon was a master of it with every one of her travels. So I think that's a piece that has really been overlooked, and until Hillary Clinton, no other First Lady had traveled
That much.
as much as she did, like 70 countries.
81.
And she went to Peru after an earthquake, and we had terrible relations with Peru at the time. And there's another picture in there of her in a suit with high heels, and she's climbing over rubble, and she wanted to go to deliver the aid. The president decorated her, and the newspapers wrote, and then our relations with Peru improved. So her diplomacy skills, I think, were just outstanding.
Absolutely. I love the trip to China, and this was a master stroke of fashion diplomacy on Pat Nixon's part. And she's arriving in communist China and coming off the plane, and of course everyone that's greeting, it's a sea of black and gray Chinese Communist Party officials. And she arrives wearing a brilliant red coat. And why is that so important? Red is the color of luck. In China, she knew that that would be conveyed as sensitive to their culture and that would be pleasing to the people of China. I mean, it is a fashion diplomacy master stroke on her part. And the trip to Peru, you know, this was a devastating earthquake. 50% of the country was destroyed. And Americans responded to the humanitarian need. The president sent humanitarian aid, and she led it. And as Diana said, this is a time in South America, Central America, where there's a lot of anti-American sentiment. There are leaders being elected that are anti-American, including the president of Peru, but yet she went there and in a way opened the doors for a relationship between our two countries. And the president of Alvarado of Peru's response that the president of the United States sending his wife meant more to the people of his country than if the president had sent the entire United States Air Force. That's how powerful her role being there was.
And I was reading something today which I had forgotten, but when she first came in, her staff and the president's staff were pressing her to pick one project. And one of her staff members wrote, and it's so interesting, you know, Mrs. Nixon, you really don't need to pick one project because your project are people. You love people, and whatever you do will show that love. So her travels and her volunteerism and her going to hospitals and reaching out to children, I thought that was a very interesting comment on the staff members' part.
And if I can mention, because we're in this recreated East Room, her impact on the White House is extraordinary. What she left behind, first of all, more acquisitions to the collection happened in the White House by Pat Nixon, more than Jackie Kennedy, more than any other First Lady. That's something she really doesn't get credit for. The way that the White House is lit at night is because of Mrs. Nixon, who felt that people should see the White House. Also, tours for the blind, tours at night for working women, installing ramps in the White House. Long before there was Americans for Disabilities Act, installing ramps in the White House so the disabled can access the White House. Having pamphlets in foreign languages printed that the visitor's office could give out to visitors from around the world so they could read about what they're seeing in the rooms. I mean, this was a way that she opened the White House in some very truly extraordinary, people-friendly ways.
Yes.
Well, and Sesame Street,
Yeah.
you know, that started during the Nixon administration, and one of the bits of primary source of research I did, digging around during COVID and talking to whatever archivists happened to be able to help me, the Nixons were behind the creation of Sesame Street. And Pat was the first invited Big Bird to the White House for a holiday party for international diplomats' children. And another great picture is of her standing next to Big Bird holding a single feather. And, you know, there's another example of her understanding communication. And that's in the chapter on communication. So, you know, as Frank said, one of the things we've done with the book, and Pat is a perfect example of this, is we introduce the women during various periods of time. So she's in the World War II wives section. But then when we get into the more thematic chapters, we bring them back and show the impact on the White House, how they use communication. And that, I think, is very, once again, very different from what anybody else has done.
Right.
And I just think we should add, too, that it was a short time when she'd been First Lady that she goes with Nixon to South Vietnam, which was
In a war zone.
battle zone, and it's the
Combat
first
zone,
time.
yeah.
It's the first time a first lady with her husband, Eleanor Roosevelt, went to a war zone, but she didn't go with FDR. Pat goes with President Nixon, and she makes a big effort to go to the hospitals, to go to the military base. And she even said she was scared, but she really wanted to show the soldiers that she cared about them. So I think that tells you a lot
About
about
her character.
grit and
Exactly.
determination.
President Nixon, the first lady he saw was Eleanor Roosevelt, and he saw her driving by in a Jeep on an island. I don't know whether it was a Green Island or Bougainville, but when he was stationed in the South Pacific, that was the first lady he saw.
It's a great anecdote.
And apropos the impact of people watching the China trip through her eyes, because of course the president was in closed-door negotiations. But for the 40th, I think, anniversary of the trip to China, we had a seminar at the Institute of Peace in Washington, and the keynote speaker was Secretary Clinton, who just came across the street from the State Department to deliver this. And she started by saying that Nixon had described that week as the week that changed the world. And she said, if anything, that was an understatement. But then she went off her script and she reminisced that she had been a law student at Yale during the trip. And she said she and a number of her classmates, because people now, people going to China is, now you don't want to go to China necessarily, but then it was exotic in an incredible way. So she said she and a lot of other students went out to rent television, black and white television sets, to bring into their room. And she described, they had the rabbit ears and they put aluminum foil on to be able to receive it. And she said, you know, that she watched this window into this whole other part of the world.
That's terrific.
She'd also, I don't want to step on your lead, but Mrs. Nixon also had a phenomenal apprenticeship as second lady.
Yes,
where
absolutely.
She broke a lot of boundaries and set a lot of precedents.
And President Eisenhower would tell Vice President Nixon for his foreign travels, take Pat with you, because he saw the reports of how she connected with the people. She was a wonderful diplomat, you know, at a time where, of course, we have to remember the country is at the height of the Cold War, and she just helped to really open up relationships. And so, right, she had 8 years being able to watch that. She had a close relationship with Mamie Eisenhower, and they did things together. So she also, Mrs. Nixon, had a long history of being, you know, a public servant herself. With her husband had served, you know, in the Congress, and she was a very active spouse with other congressional spouses as well.
There was a great scene too, that's cynical, but with two first ladies, where Mrs. Nixon invited Jacqueline Kennedy to come down with her children, because I think in 1971, for the 71, for the unveiling, Aaron Schickler had done the famous portraits of Kennedy looking down and the sort of ethereal portrait of Mrs. Kennedy. So Mrs. Nixon invited her and the two children, John Jr. and Caroline, who were 8 and 10 maybe at that time, but were young. And they sent a jet star up to New York to bring them down. It was the first time Mrs. Kennedy had been back. And apropos the lighting of the White House, which Mrs. Nixon had initiated, in her thank you letter, there's a whole exchange of, there's a whole exchange of letters.
She got it from the archives today.
She mentions that the children got to see the house lit, because that was a new thing. Did you have the letter?
Yes, I have. Jackie's handwriting is wonderful if you have not seen it. But on February 4th, 1971, she writes President and Mrs. Nixon, and it is a long letter. It's like 4 pages, and I'm just going to read a couple of parts. She says, I have never seen the White House look so perfect. There is no hidden corner of it that is not beautiful now. It was moving when we left to see the great house illuminated with the fountains playing. And she ends by saying, thank you with all my heart, a day I always dreaded, turned out to be one of the most precious ones I have spent with my children. And the backstory on that is after the assassination, President and Mrs. Johnson continually invited her, and she was very close to the Johnsons, which history is not really portrayed well, but she just kept saying, "Oh, Mr. President, I can't come." And in 1971, she's ready, but earlier in the letter, she thanks them for doing it with no publicity. She wanted to take her children to the White House to see the portraits hung, but she didn't want publicity. And they did it very elegantly, very quietly. In fact, in the letter, she thanks them for the precious Bordeaux they have served her.
For dinner.
But it is so heartwarming, and it sort of shows the sisterhood, too, between First Ladies, Pat Nixon and Jackie Kennedy, and the respect.
Right.
It was also an age of restraint because Helen Thomas, who was a reporter, saw them going in and was prepared to break the story. It would have been a big scoop. And I guess the staff spoke to her and, you know, said, this is a private visit. It's so meaningful. And she agreed to wait until they were back, until they were out.
Never happen now. That's extraordinary.
Never.
Never.
Imagine.
Your chapter, now this is also good, but your chapter is called The Overlooked First Lady. Why is that?
Because even look at all the things that we just said tonight that she did. I guarantee for you, 2/3 or more of Americans had no idea. And again, this is an example, and there are other examples in history that we illustrate in the book of First Ladies whose contributions were overlooked when there is controversy surrounding their husbands. And President Nixon said that in what you read, Frank. He recognized that all that she did and all that she contributed, you know, was that she paid the price for how he was viewed and how he was treated, and that trickled down to her. So much of what she did was overlooked. But there's a new book that's coming out about her, about her memory, by Heath Hardage Lee. That I think in the title is it The Mysterious?
The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon, yes.
And she did incredible, you know, research on that, and that will be illustrative in the same way that the book a few years ago that Karen Tumulty of the Washington Post wrote about Nancy Reagan, the triumph of Nancy Reagan. She researched this book for 4 years, and even people that knew Mrs. Reagan learned things about her that they didn't know. But back to Mrs. Nixon, we really took time and took care in the short amount of pages that we had for Mrs. Nixon to really pique everyone's interest, to appreciate and recognize what an extraordinary First Lady she was.
The standard book is Julie Nixon Eisenhower's Pat Nixon, The Untold Story, which is remarkable because she combines filial affection with with rigorous research, and of course she had great access to materials, but remarkably objective for a young author, for a daughter, for all of that. But the Heath Hardage Lee's book coming in August.
Can I just say one thing that I forgot to mention? And Diana and Nancy, we talk about this in the book. This was also, again, how we tried to put overlay of what was happening in the country at the time that First Ladies and Presidents were empowered. This was a second wave of feminism, a really activist, feminism fight out there in the country. And that group never really respected Mrs. Nixon and what she was trying to do, work behind the scenes to get more women in the federal government, be supporting the idea of a woman Supreme Court justice. It's almost as if, a Republican First Lady could not possibly have, the thoughts of supporting women in the country. So the feminist movement, they were not friends to Mrs. Nixon. They weren't to Barbara Bush either. Somehow, I think, looked at them as too traditionalist, and how could they possibly have, a thought of their own?
Well, and we should say that she wasn't helped by the West Wing staff.
Yes, that's the other issue.
Alderman and Ehrlichman did not want Pat Nixon showcased. And they repeatedly undermined her, and she tried to go about and do the important things she wanted to do. But this plays on any First Lady. What is her relationship with her husband and their staff, and how much that husband empowers the First Lady really helps her, or it's really that much harder to accomplish what you want as First Lady. And there is, Betty Ford was known for the saying, the West Wing, if the West Wing is the mind of the White House, the East Wing is the heart. And Pat Nixon really illustrated that she was the heart, but the heart was being constricted somewhat by the male chauvinism on some of the staff.
Well, and I think we also have to talk about the media, and we do have some chapters that deal with that, and it wasn't, they didn't consider what First Ladies were doing that important.
Yes.
So volunteerism, now that's what women do, is this newsworthy? She was covered during China because they had no choice. They couldn't cover him. But you stop and think about, did they really play up the fact she went into a war zone, flew in a helicopter? There wasn't as much about that as there should have been. And it wasn't just Pat Nixon, but Lady Bird was an environmentalist. She was talking about the environment, but they called it beautification because that sounded more like what a first lady should be dealing with. And Rosalind Carter, in her autobiography, mental health, she championed mental health as First Lady of Georgia. She did it as First Lady. She was the honorary chair of a commission on mental health. And when she unveiled the commission, all they wanted to ask her about was their decision to only serve wine and no hard liquor at the White House. So they wouldn't take it seriously. Like she said, it just wasn't sexy enough.
Sexy
And,
enough.
yeah, and a lot of these First Ladies' issues are the ones that follow them out of the White House and make a tremendous impact on the public. And if you stop and think about the volunteerism of Pat Nixon, that really helped set up 1,000 points of light and what George Bush did and other emphases. But it just isn't picked up by the press the way it should be.
Nancy suggested that we begin with that quote from RN, and I propose that we give for 2 or 3 minutes RN the last word. We have and Mrs. Nixon, a brief video clip from an interview that he did in 1983.
Women's Wear Daily has referred to you as Plastic Pat. Now, what's that kind of thing?
Well, I don't read everything, and also I think they've had some very nice articles which have been sent to me by the authoress. But anyway, they don't bother me. In fact, I look over criticism very carefully and think maybe I should improve on this, that, or the other.
Why do you think she was misunderstood in this way?
Well, she was called Plastic Pat because she was my wife. If she had been the wife of a liberal, my God, they would have canonized her. But because she was my wife, they had to find ways to knock her. She never got any credit for the things that she did, her foreign travels on her own. She went to Africa. She went on to earthquake zones in Peru and so forth, and did things that were rather dangerous. She was active in the programs for bringing parks to the people, for literacy, et cetera, et cetera. Part of the reason, too, was that she did not seek the publicity, and she didn't really care whether or not she got it. But I must say, one of the reasons that she didn't receive it without any question was that you can be sure that our friends in the media, whoever they may be, were not going to give her any credit if they thought it might help me. I understand that. That's part of the game. Not right, but that's the way the real world is, political world.
How does that make you feel?
Oh, I don't particularly like it, particularly where she's concerned, because she did work so hard. But let me say, American people are not stupid. It's quite remarkable, despite the fact that she has not had a particularly positive press, not nearly what she deserves, that she has been in the top 10 of the most admired women for years after we even left Washington. The Good Housekeeping poll, for example, she has never been off of that. And the reason is that people remember her as being dignified. They remember her as one devoted to her family. They remember her, too, as one She may not have worn designer gowns, but she was blessed with natural beauty. She really didn't need them. She probably is one of the most intelligent women ever to have been First Lady. She had a remarkable, of course, career in school, worked her way through college and through the University, Southern California, graduated with honors, taught for a couple of years. She's a very smart person. And also the fact that in political discussions, she doesn't say much, but she can always go to the heart for matters. She's got an enormously good intuition. I think these are factors. The average person just thinks of her as somebody that went along for the ride and so forth, plastic Pat as they called her, although I'm sure some of them didn't believe it.
Was Mrs. Nixon hurt by the lack of appreciation? Not that she sought appreciation specifically, but by the lack of it can sometimes be hurt.
No, I wouldn't say so. She was not surprised. You know, after all, we grew up very, very young. Many of these people came into high office without having really experienced some of the tough times that we did. They hadn't gone through the terrible, brutal beating I took during the Hiss case, during the fund, during the campaign of 54, 56, 58, 60s, Caracas, so forth and so on. She had been through a lot, and so consequently, she rather expected things to be as they were. She expected them to be rather bad, and they were bad.
We're not out of time, but we're up to time for some questions. But to conclude, your book deserves to be read. You call it a textbook, and it is a textbook. I have a constructive criticism, not for you, because you did your job great, but for your publisher. For speaking on behalf of geezers, it needs to be a Kindle version,
yes,
so that you can control the font.
There is a Kindle version.
There's a Kindle version now,
there is
right?
a Kindle version.
Okay, that's my unpaid political announcement.
We have been told that it needs to be an audio book,
An audio.
and people are asking for that, so we hope to push our publishers in that direction.
One last, so everyone should read it, or at least read it. One last words, what's the elevator pitch for why people need to know and read Remember the First Ladies?
Okay, this is what we've been saying. If we really are talking about inclusive history in our country, and this is a debate of inclusive history, you cannot talk about American history without including these women. And the contributions that they have made, the patriots that they have been, the legacies that they have left behind, using an unpaid, undefined role and really making it an important part of the presidency. And that's what we feel should not be overlooked.
You know, when you think about it, these men chose very well. I mean, these are amazing women who have left incredible, the more recent ones, legacies that keep on giving. The Bush Literacy Foundation, over $100 million in literacy. Mrs. Johnson's Wildflower Foundation, Mrs. Ford's American Cancer, Mrs. Ford's drug abuse and alcohol abuse. And they touch people in such personal ways that it is amazing.
And they changed the course of history some of the time. You know, you can't really study, as I've said, the arc of the presidency unless you look at the women next to them. And George understood that, which is why Martha had a role the second she landed on the New Jersey shores, and he took her over to New York. And, you know, there are incidences where, you know, a couple we like to think about. Abraham Lincoln, after he'd lost some elections, was going to be offered the governorship of Oregon Territory. And he was ready to take it. And Mary Todd Lincoln was very astute politically, and, you know, Henry Clay was a family friend. She told him if he went, he would be forgotten, and that there were political winds blowing. This was about the time the Whig Party was about to, you know, implode.
Right.
And that if he left, he wouldn't be a part of what was going to happen next.
Your chapter on her is
that's
really
the best
enlightening
example.
about her.
Yeah, you know, and Edith Roosevelt, Teddy got the Nobel Peace Prize for brokering the the end of the Russo-Japanese War. The way he did it was he couldn't communicate with foreign diplomats as president. So Edith wrote to them, wrote to the British ambassador to Russia,
St.
who was a
Petersburg,
friend.
yeah.
And when Harry Truman wants to set up the UN, who does he think of going to? Eleanor Roosevelt. And she was masterful at dealing with the Soviet ambassadors and the people who did not want a Declaration of Human Rights. And she spoke to them in a very feminine but very direct way. Look, you're not bringing your politics to this table. We are going to get this done.
Inclusive history.
So just before the questions begin, please join me in thanking Diana, Anita, Nancy for a terrific evening.
And thank you for having us.
What a wonderful opportunity to hear you all speak. Thank you very much. I will come around and moderate a few questions. Our social media team did do a poll. We're live streaming this, so you guys are going out to the world tonight. But they did do a poll, and we got a couple of questions. I don't know if I'll get through all of them, but I'd like to start with one of them. And the first one is, what is your hope that young women will take away from this book?
Wonderful question.
Well,
I think
Go ahead.
the importance of what you can do. These ladies did believe in themselves, have a lot of confidence. Rosalind Carter said very clearly, you're not going to get people who like you if you do the right thing. You just need to have a lot of confidence, and Betty Ford backed her up. A confident First Lady, stick to your agenda, stick to your love, and go forward with that. And that is a great example for all young people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the women students in my classes, they're now determined to go out and tell everybody about this, and to make women's history a part of American history, as opposed to sort of a side thing we do once a month. And they really came to appreciate the legacies, and they realized that one woman can really make a difference when they look at the kinds of legacies they've left.
Exactly.
All right, our first question from the audience.
First of all, the Nixon clip was just so endearing.
Yeah.
I thoroughly enjoyed the book, but I have a question. And this, by the way, this is not women's history, this is American history, which is really important. But as you were doing your research and looking at the relationship of the First Lady with her husband, as well as what's going on in the world at the time, did you have the opportunity to interview any of the children that are still living and how they viewed their mother's role?
Well, in fact, last week, we just presided over a conference that we organized at the Gerald Ford Library and Museum that was honoring Betty Ford's 50th anniversary of being First Lady and 40th anniversary of hosting the first ever First Ladies Conference, which Nancy mentioned. And Susan Ford was part of a panel. She had been part of the panel in 1984, the first conference. We talked to her first, so we talked to Dr. Biden for the book, of course, and we've researched materials of some of the children's. Julie's book was very helpful to us as well. But I think in terms of talking to the children, those that we knew, like I knew a number of children, of presidential children, of course, and those who are willing to share their experiences. We understand the family life is an important part of a First Lady's role, no doubt about it. And in fact, that's probably what First Ladies wanted to protect most, was the family life in the White House. And Susan Ford is very open about what it was like for her. So we have a lot of that was included, particularly in last week's conference.
I'm going to go to one more
And
question.
Linda Johnson, Robin, Lucy, of course.
Well,
Nancy's very close too, so we had a lot from them.
Lucy, in this same conference, talked about how much she hated Mrs. Johnson when she was writing the White House diary, would go to her dressing room, close the door, and put a pillow on it that says, "Please do not disturb."
Yeah.
And Lucy said she just got to hate seeing that pillow. She was so resentful of her mother. And she got really mad one time and said, you know, I can't see you, I can't do it. And then Lucy morphed forward to her being a mother and realized what Mrs. Johnson
Was trying to do.
And was much more understanding. But of course, the job is incredibly demanding to meet the obligations and then to be a good mother and to protect
The family.
your children and their privacy. And in the same conference, Mrs. Ford said she feels criticism of her president was okay, and she guessed a wife had to come in for it. But she was going to be a lion, you know, about her children.
I'm going to take one more question here from the online poll, but before I do, I want to acknowledge our members in the room tonight. We're able to put on programs like this and the other ones throughout the year, whether it's a program looking at rich history, such as tonight's, or a community program such as Memorial Day, or our annual 9/11 program, or Veterans Day, or the like. So everyone that is in here tonight that supports us, thank you very, very much for what you do to make these kinds of programs and activities possible. And so our last question will be from this online poll, and it's, who do you think is one of the most underrated First Ladies?
Well, Pat Nixon for sure, but we can add to that.
Sarah Polk. Anybody know anything about Sarah Polk? No hands are going up. There is a wonderful biography of her called Lady First. She was the power behind the throne. And there's not a whole lot anybody knows about her, but she wrote his speeches. She would get up every morning and read all the newspapers and tell him what he needed to know. She basically was behind his schedule. They had no children, so he was her career. Dolly mentored her, and she took a lead when he was in Congress and started doing bipartisan events so that when he became president, she followed Dolly's lead on that. And Polk campaigned on 4 issues, and he accomplished all 4 of them and did not run for re-election. And a lot of that had to do with Sarah Polk.
I think that we would also say Bess Truman.
For sure.
Because she did not, and the reputations of these First Ladies have a lot to do with whether they are friendly with the press or whether they pull back from the press. So that's just a fact. Bess did not like the press probably because her father committed suicide when she was young, and she didn't want people to know about that. She never told Margaret. Margaret found out and went to Harry. But she advised Truman. He went to her when he was thinking of dropping the atom bomb, and she was very instrumental in saving the White House, which Anita can.
Sure. One last point on Bess Truman is at the time that they were living there, of course, in 1948 to 1952, I mean, the White House was considered uninhabitable. It was falling apart from the inside out. And the Congress had to review the options that were available to restore the White House. The cheapest one, of course, was tearing the whole building down and just rebuilding and start over. The most expensive was keeping the exterior, going deep underground, steel girding from the inside and rebuilding from the inside and keep what we know is the historic exterior of the White House. Well, the Congress, of course, wanted to go the cheapest route. Bess Truman, who had been a wife of a senator, had been a Senate staffer. Can you imagine that happening today? She worked for her husband when he was in the Senate. She knew how the game was played. She knew who the appropriators were. She knew what buttons to push. She worked behind the scenes to her friends who were Senate spouses, to senators on the other side of the aisle as well, who were appropriators. And basically her message to them was, if you do this, the American people will never forgive you. And she was right. And so the most expensive option was chosen. The White House is preserved. Mrs. Nixon got to light it. And again, Bess Truman, a quiet first lady. At the chapter, we have first ladies who have stepped back from activism. She was one of those, of course, following Eleanor Roosevelt, how difficult that could possibly be to rise to that level. So she is somewhat overlooked. But again, when you look at the White House, think of her and what she did to help to keep it
And
intact.
as we're ending, there's one thought. Bess Truman got a letter from Eleanor Roosevelt about how she should do a press conference. Bess Truman is going, I don't want to do a press conference. Okay, Laura Bush is asked if she's going to be like Barbara Bush. And she said, I think Laura Bush is just fine. There is one real key thing that runs through most of these first ladies. Mrs. Johnson was asked if she was going to be more fashionable because of Mrs. Kennedy. No, they tend to stick to what they want to do, and they want to be themselves. And that's a very interesting trend that runs through most of them.
Well, Diana, Anita, Nancy, Frank, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Ladies and gentlemen, remember the First Ladies. It is available up in our store. All three are going to stick around to sign it. Pick up a copy. We'll see you up in the front lobby. Thank you for coming. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.